I'll never forget the day I read a book. It was contagious, 70 pages. There were pictures here and there, so it wasn't hard to bear. The day I read a book.
Discussion of the Wafer-Thin books reading group, which is an interesting experiment, I hope. For me, it's quite, I will say, I'm Brad Bigelow. I run the Neglected Books website and also edit a series for Boiler House Press called Recovered Books. And I'm actually kind of doing this sort of out of a selfish instinct, which is I've got a book I have to finish writing in the next 6 months. And I'm hoping that reading thin books will help me not spend as much time. But I have to confess, I'm failing in that end already because my office is getting filled with stacks and stacks. I'm becoming more and more fascinated by these books of 150 pages or less, or in a few cases, slightly more.
I just saw Snake by Kate Jennings there. You can move that right to the top of the list. So.
Yes, absolutely. Well, that's. I mean, I read that and I wrote about it. Snake by Kate Jennings, a late Australian writer, and this is to reread for when we do the Jen Craig month. To do, because I have a number of I mean, Australian writers have written quite an impressive number of wafer-thin books, I will have to say. And with that, let me introduce my partner in this discussion, James Morrison, coming all the way from Australia. James and I have been in touch for many years at a common interest, but this is literally the first time we've seen each other, at least virtually, face to face. So welcome, James.
That's right, yeah. Thank you. It's good. This should be fun.
And so everybody else, I mean, this is intended to be very loose, even though I'm posting it because we have folks in the UK who are interested, who are unfortunately would have to be coming in at the middle of the night, their time. And I find these things tend to, people go back to them years and years down the road. So I hope it's okay with everybody. You're agreeing to be recorded and put up on YouTube for the purpose of the discussion. If you don't, obviously mute everything and just lurk, which is perfectly fine. So this month we're going to be talking about this, and having just posted about the importance of pronouncing names, I have to confess I don't know. Is it Blecher?
I've been assuming Blecher, but yes.
Okay.
I don't like. He's Hungarian or German?
Romanian.
Well, Romanian, but German background. Romanian.
Yeah. I'm fluent in German, so it's Blecher. It's fine. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if I was in Germany, I would call it Blecher. But
yeah, I mean that's good enough.
He's what I've written a number of things about a writer named Rosemary Tonks, who's starting to get rediscovered now. And in every one of Tonks's books, she has this character I refer to as the ambiguously Central European character. Are they Hungarian? Are they Czech? Are they Romanian? It's hard to tell, and I'm not sure she ever decided in any of her books which one it was. But before we get into the discussion of the book, I just want to mention some of the other things. As I said, I've been kind of going like a kid in a candy store with this whole topic. So I posted recently about a number of these little French themed books. So there's a couple that I've written about from Wakefield Press. This one from Tony Daudet called District, which is sort of a bleak, grim view. And then we have Georges Perec's An Attempt at Exhausting a Place in Paris, which is a fabulous book, fascinating little exercise. I also read one that I can't show. A number of the books I'll talk about, I've read virtually. I actually do not mind reading on a tablet, either PDFs, usually PDFs is what I read. And so I read also, because it was recommended by somebody on Twitter, was Francis Ponge, Soap, which is an amazing book. He took 20 years to write, literally just about a bar of soap in its 3 stages: in the dish before you use it, in the water when you're washing with it, and then when you put it back into the dish. And he managed to write about 100 pages of quite complex prose about that. So and he started that book when he was actually a refugee in France after the invasion in the early 40s. So that's a real commitment to a topic, I would say. Because
you can see why soap might have been looming large in his mind because of that background.
Yeah, it does. It's actually, I think in his preface, rather than the book itself, he mentions the fact that the soap was terrible during the war. But Ponge was sort of like the high priest of close observation. He certainly inspired Perec and Duverre. And another one was, of course, Ramon Canot's exercises or in style, or exercice du style, which is a little bit over 150 pages, but another example of just looking at the same thing over and over and over from different angles. And then I also took this one, which is inspired by Perec, most of everything, which is a fairly recent one by Lauren Elkin, called number 9192, which is about her notes on a bus ride to and from her class near the École Militaire in Paris. And I also mentioned this one, which is because I happen to know her, a friend of mine named Shelby Okanya, who self-published a recent book about of notes that she published on LiveJournal over the course of about 10 years about daily life in Paris. But the most recent one that I want to mention, which I think is absolutely terrific, 99 Interruptions. And I can't tell you how long this is because it's actually unpaged, but it's literally a list of 99 interruptions. This is by Charles Boyle, who also publishes as Jack Richardson and or Jack Robinson. And this is actually from his own. These are self-published, but this is what I would call high-end self-publishing because it's very like Wakefield. In fact, I'd say in terms of format, it's almost exactly like Wakefield. Now that I look at it, but this is just so fabulous because of the fact that he notes that our lives, what we think of as interruptions, are really like the fabric of our lives. And so when we read a book, he offers the question, am I reading a book with interruptions, or is the book the one continuous element in my life and my life the things that get in the way? So I'd highly recommend that. I think you can probably get it from the major online publishers, but if you're a good person, you'll pay the ridiculous postage and order it from Boyle's. CB Editions is the publisher, what he publishes it by. And a couple other things. I published a piece recently on neglected books because I started reading. I've started to read John O'Hara's novellas, which are fascinating. He actually wrote quite a lot in the novella format, but he often didn't call them that because he slipped them in with his story collections. And then that led to reading, going back to one that I'd wanted to reread for a long time by the American writer John Marquand, who is, a lot of people refer to him as sort of the Trollope of mid-century America. He writes these great thick social observation novels, but this is a short one he wrote, published right at the end of World War II, which is 90% of this book is a dialogue between the narrator and this young Navy pilot who is essentially a nihilist in a way. And it's very shocking to Marquand to realize this guy, essentially because he's been in so many combat actions, he sees himself as expendable. He really doesn't, he doesn't believe the Four Freedoms stuff. He doesn't believe all the motherhood and apple pie stuff about the war. And that's very shocking to Marquand's character and probably to Marquand himself. And then I also reread this, which is J.P. Marquand Esquire, which is a book that a New Yorker writer named Philip Hamburger, this is a profile, a classic New Yorker profile, but Hamburger wrote it in the form of a John P. Marquand novel. So the narration and a lot of the observations are very much in the flavor of Marquand. So that was a little interesting detour along the way in the course. So that's what I've been reading this month. James, what have you been digging into?
Yes, well, the first thing is the one I'm parts way through at the moment. It's Mild Vertigo by Miyako. I'm not sure. Can I? It's a Fitzcarraldo, so the cover's already buggered. But it's sort of, if the easiest way to describe it is if a sort of Thomas Bernhard novel from the point of view of a fairly disgruntled Japanese housewife. It's written in the 90s, but it's only just been published in English. Polly Barton is the translator. And as I say, I'm only halfway through it, but it's fascinating so far. It's nice to see increasing numbers, I think, of well-established in Japan female writers who've never been published or have been very, hard to find in English, starting to get, people are venturing beyond the kind of Murakami world in terms of publishing Japanese literature. And yeah, she's someone I definitely want to read more by. Another novella, The Open Door by Margaret Oliphant. It's a sort of a classic kind of Victorian ghost story. It was actually published as a ghost story for Christmas, but because I'm in Australia, the publishers didn't actually put it out until the end of January. But yes, that's just, a sort of a very successfully creepy kind of haunted house, revenants hanging around, intersecting with the real world and trying to be a mystery to be discovered. And that was thoroughly enjoyable. And the other recent, sorry, I'll just knock everything over. I should point out, I've chosen the angle that makes the library look tidy. No other angle would succeed in doing that. And again, someone else whose name I should have checked before talking about her. I don't know if it's Bushi or Buki Emecheta, Nigerian-born English-based writer. This is from the 70s, called In the Ditch, if you can't see the cover. And yes, it's fascinating. I think it was her first novel, but it's about, being a sort of black single mother with 5 kids living in London in the early 70s, very autobiographical. And it's simultaneously alarming and surprising because it really captures the absolute rundown grot of 70s England and that kind of constant racism the character endures. But startling because you look at the state of the British welfare state in the early 70s and it looks like an absolute paradise compared to the way things have gone now. It's just astonishing what was actually provided and the kind of extent of often quite patronizing care, but the extent of care being provided that people didn't even have to fight for on a daily basis. And you compare that to the way things, in countries like Britain and Australia and Canada, the way things just been wound back over the decades. So it was quite eye-opening and surprising in that way. Couple more. Just this was The Questionable Ones by Judith Keller. It's sort of just a short book of very, very short stories. She's a Swiss writer. Nothing hugely deep, but just a lot of fun. They're each only sort of a paragraph or two for the most part. But yeah, it's just, a fun sort of hour probably is what it would take you to read it. And the last thing, the book itself is huge, but that's because it's sort of collected works. Joe Brainard's I Remember, which is sort of a non-fiction memoirish thing, but it's just 120 odd pages. Each paragraph or sentence is just I remember, and then something he remembers. So it ranges from really banal things to quite moving things, sporadically quite startlingly sexual things. But yeah, it's just a completely, I think in fact it is quite edited and organized, because this is based on the final version, because he published several versions of it during his life and expanded it and re-edited it. So I think it actually has quite a careful form, but it has a very free and almost deliberately unartful structure to it, but that I think actually hides quite a lot of work. But it's just, yeah, again, a tremendously enjoyable book. And the other thing I'd mention, it's not any book in particular, and Brad probably can't mention these because he's of personal connections and past. But if people are looking for novellas and short books, there's this whole series of books that the University of East Anglia publishes through their Strangers Press. These are from the most recent. And every year, they just once or twice a year, they publish a collection of 6 or 8 really chapbooks. But yeah, in each case, there are a couple of short stories or a novella or a few essays. They're around about 50 pages long. This lot are Korean, and they've done at least one Korean series before. They've done a Japanese series, a Swiss series, several others. And they just have a huge, often people who have not been published in English anywhere else. And yeah, they're just really wonderful little books. You can I think you just order it from them. You get this whole set. Is probably the easiest way to do it internationally without going bankrupt. But yeah, they're always worthwhile. So yes, that's my recent short reading.
Okay. Does anybody else want to chime in with good stuff they've done, or shall we jump right into talking about Max Blecher's book? Well, if not, so James, so when we put together this list of 12 for this year, there were some back and forth. I mean, we probably had 40, 50 titles to start with that we kind of weeded down. So we ended up eliminating nonfiction primarily because we just couldn't land on a good one, and there was so much good fiction that we wanted to highlight. And we also wanted to have a range of countries, languages, translations, also different historical periods. So I guess the earliest is probably Heinrich von Kleist with Michael Kohlhaas, but and then stuff that's been published within just the last few years. So this was one that you recommended, James. So tell us why'd you pick this one?
Well, there's sort of the general and the specific. Generally, I mean, if you ask me to find 12 great short books, I could just populate the entire thing with Austro-Hungarians or former Austro-Hungarians, such as Max Blecher. I mean, it just this huge, multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious society that lasted far longer probably than it was ever likely to, and just this sheer profusion of amazing writers in all sorts of languages. I mean, a lot of them in German, but Czech writers, and in this case Romanian writers. I mean, he was born in Austro-Hungary. By the time he was an adult, that had fallen apart because he was born, I think it was at 1909. Yes. So, but just the atmosphere in which he grew up was just one that produced, as I say, an astonishing amount of fantastic literature. But I think we only have 2 Austro-Hungarians in our final 12. I think we have. Do we have Joseph Roth? I can't remember now. Maybe we
didn't end up with Roth because we had settled on Schnitzler.
That's right. Yes, another. So that's the general starting point. But more specifically, why this book is, I came to Blecher because a while ago I read his Scarred Hearts, which was his second novel after this one. Because I've always been interested in, I guess sanatorium literature. A lot of great books have been written by and about people, stuck somewhere suffering from TB in this slightly artificial mini societies that form.
Only in Central Europe, really. Like it's sort of. I mean, it's like Thomas Mann and Bernhard that do it, but like I don't think of anybody else. Anyway, keep talking.
But no, you're right. It's a very Central European thing, and so you have these kind of mini societies of people, all of whom are quite ill, and plus the staff. And this particularly struck me because apparently quite a common symptom of late stage tuberculosis is this sort of form of almost euphoria. And so this is quite an odd book because it's a book about a whole lot of people dying who are in incredible high spirits, not for logical reasons, but the atmosphere it conjures up was quite amazing. And so I was just, anything else this guy writes, I want to get my hands on. And this, as I say, though it's a book that, you know, was published in Romanian in the late 30s, did not come out in English until I think it was 2015, 2016 that Michael Henry Heim published it. There is another different translation online that's just been published, I think, free through a university website a few years ago as well. But anyway, he was.
There's actually
it was not easy to find.
A third from a university press in the UK as well.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So Marina Sophia allowed me to reproduce a piece she had written a couple of years ago, and so that's a fascinating aspect. The fact that three translators all essentially descended upon this book and found it was worth translating, you know, essentially all together in the same time period, a good 60, 70 years after it came out.
Yes, I suppose the 70-year thing is perhaps suggestive. Perhaps a lot of Blecher fans were out there and they just needed the copyright to expire so they could actually get at it without problems. But yeah, so that's why I originally read this book, and yeah, it stayed with me ever since. I mean, it's not a conventional narrative, you'd have to say, but it is in some ways. As I say, we were talking before we started recording, but the first and probably the last chapters are slightly unrepresentative, and that they're a lot more, you know, oblique and peculiar. But in fact, it's almost is a standard realist novel. It's just that the person it is writing about and their point of view, which is kind of faithfully and carefully captured, is a deeply, deeply odd one. So it's unusual for that fact. And I just really liked it because it, more than probably any other book I can think of, captures the way that so much of what we perceive and take for granted going about our lives, so much of human perception is incredibly contingent on, you know, the shortcuts our brains take, the, you know, glitches built into our sensory organs that just make us see things in a way that means we can cope. But if anything goes even slightly awry with that, the world is an incredibly odd and vividly peculiar place. And I can't think of any other book that does such a good job at capturing that. I mean, he's himself explicitly talks about being interested in that in here. You know, there's parts where he talks about talks about looking at the world and almost inverting it so that all the physical objects around him become hollow spaces, right, moving through a kind of solid medium, which is what we would normally think of as, you know, the empty air. But
that's funny. It's funny, if I can, I just, that was actually the passage I flagged to read, or it may be the one, which is, objects on the whole I perceived as backdrops. The notion of the world as stage accompanied me everywhere. Life seemed to unfold in the midst of some sad artificial performance. Indeed, the only way out of the tedious vision of a lackluster world was to see it as theater, bombastic, and passé.
And he takes it to the point of actually, yeah, one of his happiest places is to basically invade this theater that no one seems to notice he's coming and going from, and sitting in the prop box on the side of the stage, sorry, the prompter's box on the side of the stage, and just, right, yeah, kind of just being there. And it talks about, I mean, at one point his doctor says he's got paludism, which as far as I know is just the Romanian name for malaria. And I don't know if that's what he himself suffered from. It's not, I think, for most people with malaria, I don't think this is their experience of having a malarial infection, this sort of way of looking at the world. So I don't know if it's actually connected or if that's just at the time. I mean, I'm taking the book as being fairly heavily autobiographical because to my understanding it is, as was Scarred Hearts. I mean, this is a man who, you know, his last 10 years of life, he was stuck in bed writing. So he had, I think, a very vivid inner life, but not a huge amount of personal experience to draw on. But what he did have, he mined very, very thoroughly. So as to the exact reason he perceives the world in this way, I don't really know. but it really, as I say, years after having read it, I couldn't remember a lot of the details, but just the atmosphere, the overwhelming atmosphere of the book is something that stayed with me. And in fact, rereading it, I'd forgotten just how peculiar it is. I remembered, something of it, but there's a lot of the detail that's like, oh yeah, this is really quite odd. And the other thing I like about it is I'm very much of the Henry James. I don't know if anyone knows where he said this, but allegedly he said, "Tell a dream and lose a reader." And I normally cannot stand dreams in my fiction, but this is one of the very few books where the dreams, the hallucinations, or what he thinks are hallucinations, like there's an encounter, sort of sexual encounter in a ruined building basement with a young boy, and another bit where he kind of hangs over this poor woman, telling her that he's a tree, and you're not entirely sure if either of them ever happened, and he's not entirely sure if they happened. But there's something about first of all, the dreams or the hallucinations genuinely feel like real dreams and hallucinations, whereas most fictional writers cannot get that right. They know there's always something lacking. They always feel like something that's in the book to further a point rather than the sort of dream real people could have. But they also
can I jump in here just with the observation about, because I thought that's fascinating, because I have been having, in the last 10 years, I've had such vivid dreams, which I didn't have before so much in my life. And the thing that gets me about my dreams, at least, is that they don't have what I find falls apart in a lot of fiction is the writers try to make the dreams stories rather than series of sensations, and sort of you see an image, and so there's a continuity. My dreams don't have continuity. I had a dream last night that I met with my daughter and some of her friends in a nightclub, and she said, "I've got to go see my therapist." Got up, walked out. Her therapist was on the bus, and the next thing I know is we're having the discussion, in the morning rush hour on the bus about why has it taken so long to justify why she's seeing a therapist. And it made dream sense, but it's not a narrative. Obviously, it's just this sort of cacophony of images in some ways.
That's it. And most writers, they either have to make it a little story, or they have to make it's got to mean something in the wider plot that they're putting together, and neither of way convinces. Whereas this, they capture the nonsensical but internally meaningful nature of a dream that doesn't come over into your waking life, but also the way you can wake up from it with this urgent need to communicate something, but because that communication has come from the dream, it doesn't make any sense. So this urgent need he's got to tell this poor woman that he's a tree, and he can't even get that out articulately, let alone as to what it might mean. But just this absolute, this is something I must impart to the world, even though I can't even articulate why it's important or what it means. And it captured that really well. And I would normally not be able to take that at all in a book, but this is one of the rare cases I will accept dreams in my fiction. So
or trauma or an anxiety that's not fictionally composed. So you get the feeling of trauma and anxiety, but in a very weird thing, like his thing about being a tree, but not being able to discuss it. Where, as you said, fictionally, somebody would have to polish it up. So you're like, oh, well, that's really traumatic, and tie it to something thematic in the story where this isn't it, but you get the feeling of the trauma and the anxiety anyway.
Yes, that's exactly right. Big things have happened in his mind, and whether they're tied to something that's happened in his life, they may or may not be the case. But something big has happened, and he needs to tell it, but he can't make any more sense of it than anybody else.
Right. One question I wanted to ask, and if anybody has views, please chime in, is, this isn't a narrative in the sense of a beginning, middle, and end. It doesn't have a narrative arc per se. At least I didn't think it did. but I enjoyed reading it because his imagery is so powerful, the experiences are so odd, and he sticks with them. When you're saying, this, don't go into the basement, it doesn't make sense. This is going to turn out to be weird. But I'm also wondering, and this is kind of a general theme for this year, I guess, is one of the reasons it works because this is a short book. In other words, for me, if I think back on it, if this book was 300-400 pages long, I think I would stop reading. I think it would. I don't see how any writer could sustain that kind of framework into the larger framework of a novel. And one of the things I am interested in looking at, I mean, like this Perec book. Perec wrote some, he wrote Life a User's Manual, right? So it's a big ass book. And this one is about 50 pages long, and it's maybe not even that, and it's basically a list of observations that he's noting down as he's sitting in a cafe or standing on a sidewalk watching what happens in the square. It's sort of fascinating, and you can read it for 50 pages. A 500-page novel like that, I think, would just not work. Or only the great hardy readers among us would make it to the end.
I think that's true. I mean, but like the Perec, it's an attempt at exhausting this place. This small thing is all you need, and I think the same applies to this book. It's a rich and strange thing, but you don't want to eat. You don't want to eat rich and strange food, a big meal of that all the time. You taste something peculiar, and go, well, that was interesting. This is not what I want my life to be. This is not what I want my meal to be. But that was something I'll not forget.
Right.
And I think that's true. I mean, that's partly why, novellas in general are very much my thing. You can take something and polish it up and make it a perfect, rich example of whatever it is, but you don't have to, hammer it out for 400 or 500 or 600 pages. And yeah, this I think is a particularly, strong example of why that shorter form works for things like that.
I think in my conversation with Marina Sophia that's been posted, and I posted a thing on that I found actually in O'Hara's preface to his novellas, is at least he published 3 novellas. He's very crafty, at least in his publisher, and I think it was Random House during the Bennett Cerf days, but he published 3 novellas in 3 little hardback volumes, but in a little box set. It's called Sermons and Soda Water. And I have there you go, which is actually a really neat package.
Yeah.
But
yes, it's only about 300 pages all told, but you get this big brick of a thing.
It's amazing.
So if you ever come across those, they're all, I think O'Hara is one of the great readable writers of all time. I think partly because he writes so much in dialogue, and there's a tendency, at least for me, that I'm whipping through the pages when I'm reading that. He doesn't have a lot of heavy narration in his books, but
Brad, you sparked a memory, because when I was college age many years ago, I had a volume. My parents had a volume that was called 16 Short Novels. So you can imagine, like, sort of 3 inches thick, and like literally 16. We would call them novellas, right? And
right.
One, I didn't read all of them, but I read the first one, which I can't remember what it was. It might have been Nabokov or somebody, and the second one was O'Hara, and it was a woman's name. I want to say it was like Justine or some name like this, a shorter, like regular American first name of a woman, I think. And I read it. Was very, I had only read Appointment to Samara at that point, and it was pretty similar stuff. And the other thing, this specialty of an American writer having these like sub 100 page works of fiction reminds me of a writer I read a couple of years ago when I was still on Twitter, so that would have been like 21 or 22, which was Katherine Anne Porter, and she had 3 or 4 of these novellas that she wrote, and it stuck in my mind. And I read one called Noon Wine, which is outstanding. It's really good. And it stuck in the mind because apparently Porter herself detested the term novella. She called them short novels too. And she had like, it was a real thing with her, but she just like, don't bring that word to her. She didn't like wafer-thin books. I feel like you're kind of sneaking in the same direction there a little bit, you know, with
a little bit.
Novella's a little bit overused maybe, or it doesn't describe anything or something, right? So anyway, that's my little spiel on two American, sort of masters of the short form, you know. So,
and I think you're right. I mean, with John O'Hara, since talking about him, I mean, Katherine Anne Porter, about her longer novels, I think are wonderful too. But I have to say, John O'Hara, I think particularly in the short, I mean, a lot of his own writing was, you know, big books about big complex society stuff. But the stuff that I think has survived the best is, the short stories and novellas. It's something. The bigger books have almost the feel of a kind of a proto-airport novel, you know, sort of a
yes,
a sort of a Michener style. You know, we're cramming everything in, whereas the short stuff just has what you need in it.
How many? I think there's a comparison here to feature-length movies where there are some subjects where like 55 minutes is the correct length, but you can't find a distributor for that. And actually, you probably really can't find an audience even without the commerce side of it. Maybe the audience doesn't really want it either. Some subjects are like that. And there are probably, I can't really think of any, but there might be movies where you could be like, God, that we got involved in this crime plot, and like, what are we even doing? Why did this stupid thing last 90 minutes? You know, and I feel like you can imagine the sort of 250 page or 335 page version of that, where it's like, this stuff all got in the way of what was good about the book, you know.
Yeah.
One thing I have to, just while we're on this tangent, is I have to say, last year I came across, I think, a YouTube channel that had been someone who just obviously had all these old video recordings of the old, I think, BBC and ITV Play for Today things, which often were just a one-off TV movie, but the length often seems to have been dictated by what the story needed. So if it was a 45-minute film, that was what they made. If it was a 80-minute film, that was what they made. So you had no particular length, so just whatever the story required. And a lot of them were adapted from, you know, short stories by people like William Trevor, for example. And I think he even wrote the scripts for a couple of them. And that letting the substance and what the thing itself is like dictate the length is something that is not happened. I mean, you can see that even particularly in English language publishing. I think a lot of publishers just do not like to publish very short books because they think, whether it's true or not, people.
It's funny you mentioned that, because on Twitter I started a thread asking if people had noticed this as a recent trend of like the last 15 or 20 years of like, if it ain't 280 pages, we're not going to publish it. And my theory was that these works that we're talking about were a little older. But then in that thread, actually, people were like, I don't know, I don't buy it. I think there's short stuff now too. And so then I had to rethink my premise. But I do think in the major publishers, there probably are examples of books that came in at like 210. And then, you know, some publisher was like, we need another character. You've got to beat this thing. And I think if you think of Penguins, particularly Penguins from the 50s and 60s, you know, 191 pages is dandy. They were perfect to do that.
Yeah.
And the pages weren't that long. They were pretty brisk, you know. And so I think maybe we lost something there, you know. But
I mean,
I think there's a couple of, I think there's an economic factor. Definitely publishers, and you know, this is what Marina said in our conversation, and O'Hara said it in his preface, which is, you know, buyers say, you know, well, that doesn't look, I mean, here's a Notting Hill edition, which has got tons of wonderful little books under 200 pages. And they, you know, I don't know. Well, no, I'll pick up this big, you know, door stopper. I think there's also a cultural element, which is, you know, having lived in Belgium, where you walk in and, you know, the Dutch books and French books aren't published in hardback, hardly ever. You know, they're published in these little paperback editions, high class paperback. So they may actually have a wraparound jacket. And there's much more of a tradition, particularly in French, of the nouvelle, of the book that's around this length of 150 pages, 120 pages. and it's quite acceptable, and nobody thinks twice about, oh, this
Well,
is kind of a thin book. I mean,
I've got
think
here
about
all
Camus. I mean, Camus, most of his books were under that page
exactly.
count.
I hear all the Simenon Maigret novels, and if one of them breaks 150 pages, something has become very surprising. But you couldn't now publish a conventional crime novel of that length. It just would not be done. It has to be 300, 400 pages. People just wouldn't buy it.
Stout is a good example. Early part of the century into the 50s, just very brisk moving, plenty of enough to, it's not totally laconic, but it gets it moving. Early Dick Francis, lots of the early writers.
Elmore
Leonard, 220.
Yeah, a lot of the American, the pulp writers. I mean, there's a lot of stuff I've got here published by Stark House, who resurrect a lot of pulp writers. And they're sort of 150, 200 page novels. I mean, they were often magazine published or published as cheaply as possible, so they didn't want too many pages. But it's all that the books need,
Yeah. In fact, I have a stack here. I read about half of these, but these are basically the complete works of Theodora Keogh, who coincidentally was like a grandniece of Teddy Roosevelt. But she wrote these little, she lived in France for a long time, and that might have been where she picked up the bug, but she stays within these, most of them are about 150, 160, 130 pages long, usually about quite odd characters. There's usually some sort of hidden sexual element that's percolating underneath, and they could be published, partly they could be published because this is exactly what they wanted to put, in drugstores and supermarkets when people bought their books there. All they had to do was put a flashy cover on it. And, I could be holding this. It could be literally a Simenon book, because this is a signet book from the early 50s. And Simenon published a bunch of his American novels, based, or American set novels. Signet reissued them as paperbacks with the same sort of gaudy photo or painting on the front, and come hither kind of blurbs. So I think it's weird because on the one hand, I think I look at here's Wakefield, and almost everything they publish is in that kind of ballpark, and it's a beautiful book. It's a pleasure to read. It's well thought out, well curated catalog, and I don't have a problem paying for that. But I guess booksellers don't like them. What Marina was saying is simply the fact that a bookseller sticks the book in, and that's all the shelf presence you have in terms of spine, turns off some people.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, because if you put me in a bookshop and said, this shelf, these are all 150-page books by Czech people about weird goings on, I'd just sweeping them all into the bag.
Well, to me, that's one of the things I'm already enjoying about this year is, I'm at that point in my life. Honestly, I look at a thick book and I think, okay, how many days investment is that? Whereas I pick up Max Blecher and it's 2 days, and that's because I'm a slow reader.
I look at the 500-page books and I'm like, I could read 3 or 4 shorter books in that time. And the 500-page one probably needs to be edited desperately if it's modern. So
you remember that when the pandemic started, I contacted him and asked him for short reads. And James started probably maybe your best, the most.
That's right. That's all your fault. I'd forgotten that. Yeah.
and so I was, it's a long story, but I'm a freelance editor and blah blah blah, and I didn't have any work at that moment, and I wanted to stop from like doom scrolling and watching CNN or whatever about this horrible pandemic that was a brand new thing, and I decided I was going to read a book a day. Well, you can't read War and Peace in a day. You can't do it. So I needed short. And a funny thing happened to me where I began to sort of detest books that were like 300 and up, where I was kind of like, who the fuck do you think you are at 426 pages? I'm not going to read this. And it's like 2 years or so, my reading habits were really warped because it was like, 178, like that's my speed. And it took me, in the last couple of years, some other reasons for reading books came in front of me, and I began sort of loosening up on that, and I don't really care anymore. But obviously, I have the thing where I want to pat myself on the back for having added to the count of books I've read. Like I'm sort of bent in this way. But anyway, so yeah, short books, and you can multiple things.
And the other thing is it allows you to experiment.
Yeah,
you can read a wider range of stuff because no individual book is a significant investment. The other thing I wanted.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say that one other thing that I don't think is commented on much about a short book is that if you read, say, a 500-page book over several days, your memory of the earlier bits does fade, no matter how good you are. It's, even if you're reading quite close, sometimes you're like, who is this guy? You got to flip back. If you read a short book in, say, 1 or 2 sessions, you can hold the whole structure of the thing is in your head. You're looking at the whole painting at once. You're not kind of scanning along it in several, goes, looking at the detail, but never getting the whole thing. Being able to have the whole work of art in your head as a thing you can contemplate, I think is what is so good about, a short novel or a short story. And that I don't think it's much remarked on, but I think it gives you a more full experience of reading a book.
Mm-hmm.
You can pick up the rhythm and stay with the rhythm because you don't have very long. You have to do that.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I think also format-wise, there are things that a writer can do in the space of 100 pages that just it doesn't work at all structurally when you multiply that by 2 or 3 times.
The 300-page form has got a lot of traffic in it, right? So like you're not going to reinvent some crazy new way of doing a 300-page novel, but if you hit something like 65-page, I just read Lightning Rods. I know James is a big fan of Lightning Rods.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And she wrote that crazy fucking 70-page book like a couple of years ago. That was kind of amazing. Like that she could
the English understand wool.
Yeah, that you can actually sort of do something actually new if you stay short,
Yeah. Well, there's definitely a lot more playing around with, crossing genres. I think of one, no, I can't find it. Oh, here it is. One that we tried to talk about last year when I was doing sessions with individual publishers. This is also from Wakefield. This is actually a Danish novel called, anybody's guess on how to pronounce this, Kzradock, the Onion Man. And this is a book from, I think, 1909-ish, 1910. This is like a Nick Carter novel, dime novel from the 1890s. It's like a Jules Verne. It's like a Kafka. It's a little bit like Max Blecher because much of it is sort of a dreamlike insanity state. There's a little bit of Keystone Cops in it as well. And, it's all packed into, what is it? 136 pages. So, yeah, I mean, now the other thing I wanted to just an observation is in terms of terminology, from what I have seen, because I've gotten so obsessed with this, is American publishers really loved the term short novel from like the 20s to the 70s, 80s-ish. And so you saw these collections of short novels. You saw short novels by, a particular writer. So Katherine Anne Porter, 3 short novels. You would see that. And then in more recent decades, probably the last 2 decades, suddenly novella is sort of like more acceptable, it seems to be. But the second thing that I'm curious to explore this year is what I'm calling thick wafer-thin books, which is, I don't have one at hand, unfortunately, here, but I am discovering so many of these 2 novella, 3 novella collections which I guess publishers put out because, again, it's a bang for buck. I couldn't sell you 2 thin books, but I'll send you one, 300 pager or one 250 pager or one, I mean, a lot of, like Rachel Ingalls has some of them. Natalia Ginsburg, her US publisher, collected a bunch of hers in 2s and 3s and
Yeah.
4s.
Patrick Melrose books are kind of in that direction. That's like
that's
get
yes.
5
Every time
books.
a new one came out, they just put them all together, and you just getting thicker and thicker. Yeah. And I think I've got, like,
I mean, that kind of packaging, it's sort of like the work itself is a wafer-thin book, but the packaging is an assemblage of things. And one of the books that I have on my list for this year is a collection that came out in the 30s called The Flying Yorkshireman, which the title novel, and there were, if you go into a used bookstore of any quality in the US, you will find a copy of The Flying Yorkshireman. They must have had it on book clubs or something, because it's like 600-700 pages long, so it's a hefty book. But it's like 6 or 7 novellas, one of them by Eric Knight, the English writer, the guy who wrote Lassie. But the rest of them are essentially relatively unknown writers. Yeah, they're Modiano, they could package 3 books of his, and here it went out. Whereas in the French market, you would buy them, individually. Actually, Annie Ernaux, a lot of her stuff is right in this space, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, I think Europe is more welcoming to this sort of thing, just in general,
Yeah. So I guess we didn't really spend a lot of time talking about, but I just wanted to go back and circle back on Max Blecher. I'm not sure we convinced anybody who didn't want to read it that it's worth thinking about, except seriously, if you were going to do a dream novel, this is the way to do it. A dream sort of hallucination, crossing the line in and out of fantasy and a reality, or dream and reality, nightmare and reality.
Sexual inappropriate behavior, if people are after that might bring in the crowds. I don't know.
Thinking about it as a series of vignettes that are kind of tied together, some flow into each other, and some, all of a sudden you're talking about a family. I'm like, who's this family?
Right.
Yes, and it loops around.
Like the
in time
Webers
back
came
and
from
forth.
out of nowhere, and I'm like, did I miss hearing about the Webers? No, we just know all about them, and the 2 sons and the dad, and all of a sudden we just knew about them.
Yeah, here's this house that we now are being told about because someone died, but the someone who died is not someone who's been mentioned previously in the prose. So.
Yeah, it's actually, that he does some things that people like Alain Robbe-Grillet would take great credit for inventing, which is discontinuous narratives and fragmentary stories. Well, and this is one of the things that gets me, which is, everybody thinks stuff, everything old is new again. That's what it is. A lot of this stuff, let's pat ourselves on the back for trying fictional experimentation. Look a little bit further, a little bit harder, and you can find stuff like that. Writers have been playing around with stuff for so long. This is certainly an example of how that's been done.
And actually, it struck me, the other thing I meant to say earlier is that fragmented and sudden introduction of people, you don't know who they are. It reminded me, it's again the difference between if you picked up someone's diary in real life and read it, and the way diaries are written in fiction. In diaries in fiction, or always artfully or less artfully, will introduce the character so you know who's being talked about. Or if someone who's writing their own diary just says, Fred gave me the shits today. They don't tell you who Fred is. They don't set the scene because they're not writing for the audience in the same way. And this had that kind of feel. It just, these people are here and this is what happened. And, you can work it out from the context, but yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just want to mention our book for next month is this one, An Untouched House by Willem Frederik Hermans. So it's a Dutch novel set right in the last days of World War II. And if you like wafer thins, the Dutch are also, there are a number of great Dutch wafer-thins out there. Harry Mulisch has published a few. I guess the Assault is probably 200, but that's a sort of a similar sort of things.
Willem Elschot. I don't know if that's,
yeah, right.
Yeah. If that's pronounced right. Elschot, yeah.
The one thing I've learned is how to pronounce Flemish and Dutch. Elschot. Yes. Kees Noteboom is another. He's written a number of these skinny ones. This is one actually I just got. I didn't know exists before. A series of very, very short stories by A.L. Snyders called Night Train, translated by Lydia Davis. And this guy, exactly 150 pages. So of course I had to get it. And this is sort of one of my February projects is all these. I've only got 2 physical ones in hand, but all these train related wafer-thin books. So I've got a couple of on my tablet. Night Train is a very popular title, it seems. Martin Amos wasn't the only guy to use it. So Snyder's Night Train. This is one by Christian Oster, French writer, called In the Train. I have another one coming, and of course Simenon's The Train, which I think is one of his better.
There's the most recent Martin I'm going to get her name wrong too. De Carangelis, the French writer. Her most recent one is it's just set on the Trans-Siberian Railway. And that's just Eastbound. That's it. Thank you. Yes, I could not remember the title. Yeah.
I was desperately searching for my copy of it because that's in the list too. So I mean, that's one of the things you can do is you can kind of pick a country to focus on and look at a couple of theirs. Pick a writer to focus on. Pick a completely random topic like trains or death. There's lots of thin books about death.
Sanatoriums.
Sanatoriums. Well, James, if you want to put together a short reading list,
I should do actually.
Yeah.
I've been reading Magic Mountain, not a thin book, but it's developing a constellation of wafer-thin books around it. Like this, he had tuberculosis, and now his second novel that you mentioned, James. Now, of course, I really want to read it. And then there's a Russian novel that I've been reading that's taking place in the same area, although it's a weird little esoteric thing. And, it's
what's that one?
The Russian one? Oh boy, what is it called? The Elixir of Life. It's really cheesy from the late 18th century, 19th century, I think. I don't know if it's been translated or not. But it's a quirky little thing, and it's not very big, but that's sort of in that Magic Mountain constellation now. So it's weird.
I mean, if we want to expand to the topic of illness, this is a great one, and I think I've mentioned before, which is In the Land of Pain by Alphonse Daudet, who died of syphilis, which infected his spine. And basically the last couple of years of his life were in constant agony. Translated by Julian Barnes. Really an amazing book. So illness and sanity, if we can broaden it to illness, there's lots of those.
Yeah.
Getting back to death, the one I would have mentioned, which I will probably mispronounce the author's name, Black Forest by Valérie Mréjen, which is only 80 pages, and it's all very, sometimes a couple of paragraphs, sometimes a few pages, all relating to death. I think I originally read it in, trying to think, it was an online one, but I've actually gone and got my own physical copy now because I loved it a lot. I think I did mention it to James last year.
Yes, I've got that on my
other bookcase in the other room, so I'd have to run.
Yeah, that's my list of things I have to get.
Well, Gordon, if you can, and anybody else, I mean, we've got things typed in the chat, which I will try to transcribe and put as the notes when I post this. But if there are other books that, like the one Gordon mentioned, If you want to send me an email at any of my many various addresses with the title and the author, I'd be happy to add that. And because a lot of this is really just, I want to encourage folks to to use this framework to do exploring, like I'm doing exploring. It's been great, and I'm looking forward to it. But I always love these
Despite the
recommendations.
state of this nonsense, I'm always looking for more. So
Spoken like a true addict.
yeah,
And
exactly.
I just pulled, I don't know, 30 or 40 Russian books with novellas off my shelves to start a new project of reading
Great.
wafer-thin things. Texts. Russian publishers tend to publish a lot of collections that might include a novella or two or three, plus some short stories, maybe a play. They put together some interesting compilation books. So I'm not even sure what else. There's probably lots more on the shelves that I haven't read. But I'm thinking some Pinyak would be interesting, and I did pull a Nabokov English language novel, and there's just and I'm going to start with Avakum, who was burned for being a heretic in the 17th century. His life, he wrote an autobiographical piece that's a very wafer-thin book, but that has more. Well, the book itself is kind of normal size, but more than half of it is apparatus. So
you just reminded me actually, because was it Columbia when
yeah, this is from the
weren't
Columbia
scared
series.
of publishing Russian stuff. They were like
Yes.
often two novels in one book. So yeah, that was really good.
Yeah, it's very common. Yeah, so I've got all these books to read. I'm gonna put them in my little book cart tonight and see what I've got. And yeah.
That's
So
great.
Russian,
I mean, I'm looking forward, even if it's stuff that we haven't, hasn't been translated. It just, intrigues us. And I can tell you from my site, I don't get much feedback on my site, but I know there are a lot of people in publishing who lurk and take notes and go off and do things. So,
well, I'm always interested to know if you could somehow be tied into the ABE searches after you post something and see, like, do they all shoot up for that particular title or that particular author?
Yeah,
because that's what I'm normally doing. I mean, go straight to the Internet Archive and straight to ABE to see if I can find a copy. So
yeah.
I'm the same.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. We've gone over the hour. I want to appreciate for joining, and I hope this continues to be a lively format for us throughout the year. I'm looking forward to the reads. Most of the recommendations come from James. I'm giving that as credit, not blame, but we'll see as this time goes along.
You have to do all the organizing work, and I just got to point at the book, so I think I got definitely the easier job.
Well, I'm happy to do it just to facilitate a discussion. So thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you in February. Take care.
Thank you.
Okay.